The year was 2147, and Earth had changed beyond recognition. Skyscrapers made of shimmering glass reached into the clouds, their surfaces alive with moving holograms advertising everything from vacations on Mars to new flavors of synthetic food. Autonomous vehicles zipped through the air like metallic birds, while robots roamed the streets, delivering packages and assisting humans in their daily lives. Yet, for all its technological wonders, the heart of humanity still beat the same as it always had, driven by dreams, fears, and connections. In a quiet corner of this futuristic city stood a small laboratory tucked away from the noise of the bustling metropolis. Inside, Elias Voss, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, worked tirelessly at a desk cluttered with papers, tools, and glowing screens. His lab coat hung loosely over his thin frame, and though his hand shook slightly with age, his movements were precise as he adjusted a tiny component in a device that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. Elias wasn't just any scientist. He was one of the brightest minds of his generation. Decades ago, he had pioneered cryogenic technology, a method of freezing living beings so they could survive long journeys through space without aging. It was an invention born out of necessity, a way to help humanity explore the stars despite the vast distances between planets and stars. But for Elias, it was also personal. This technology had been his gift to someone very special, his best friend, Cal Arden. 60 years earlier, Cal had left Earth on a mission that would take him farther than anyone had ever gone before. He was chosen to lead an expedition to Proxima Centauri, a distant planet orbiting the closest star to Earth's solar system. At the time, it was humanity's first real attempt at colonizing another world, and Cal, with his adventurous spirit and fearless determination, was the perfect candidate. But there was one thing about the mission that haunted Elias even now. Cal had volunteered knowing it might mean never seeing his home or his best friend again. Their friendship had started when they were children growing up in a small town far from the glittering cities of today. Back then, life was simpler, filled with afternoons spent climbing trees, building makeshift spaceships out of cardboard boxes, and dreaming of exploring the cosmos. Elias was the thinker, always coming up with ideas and plans, while Cal was the doer, eager to turn those ideas into action. Together, they were unstoppable, each complementing the other's strengths and weaknesses. But as they grew older, their paths began to diverge. While Elias pursued science and engineering, fascinated by the mysteries of the universe, Cal became a pilot for the Interstellar Exploration Corps, drawn to the thrill of discovery and adventure. Despite their different careers, their bond remained unshaken. They wrote letters, shared stories, and supported each other through every challenge. That is, until the day Cal received the offer to join the Proxima Centauri mission. Elias remembered that day vividly. They had been sitting in a cafe near the launch facility, sipping coffee as they often did during breaks from work. Cal had arrived late, his face flushed with excitement. "Elias," he said, leaning forward, "they want me to go to Proxima Centauri being me. Can you believe it?" Elias froze, his cup halfway to his lips. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The magnitude of what Cal was saying hit him like a tidal wave. Proxima Centauri was over 4 light-years away. Even with advanced propulsion systems, the journey would take decades, and once Cal arrived, there was no guarantee he'd ever come back. "You can't be serious," Elias finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a one-way trip." Cal nodded, his expression softening. "I know, but think about it, Elias. This is our chance to make history, to prove that humanity can reach the stars. Don't you see? This is everything we've ever dreamed of." Elias wanted to argue, to tell Cal that dreams weren't worth risking their friendship, but deep down, he knew Cal was right. This mission wasn't just about exploration. It was about hope, about proving that humanity could overcome any obstacle. And if anyone could succeed, it was Cal. So instead of protesting, Elias forced a smile. If anyone can do it, "It's you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Just promise me one thing." "Anything," Kel replied instantly. "That we'll see each other again. No matter what happens, no matter how long it takes, we'll find a way to reunite." Cale grinned, reaching across the table to clasp Elias' hand. "You have my word. 60 years, 100 years, it doesn't matter. We'll meet again." That promise became the anchor of Elias' life. After Cale's departure, Elias threw himself into his work, determined to create technology that could bridge the gap between them. Cryogenic stasis pods were only the beginning. Over the years, he developed faster propulsion systems, improved life support mechanisms, and even experimented with quantum communication devices. Each breakthrough brought him closer to fulfilling his dream of bringing Kel home. But progress came at a cost. As the years passed, Elias grew increasingly isolated. Friends and colleagues admired his brilliance, but found him distant and aloof. He attended conferences and gave lectures, but his mind was always elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of Kel. At night, he would sit alone in his lab, staring at old photos of the two of them together. In those moments, he allowed himself to wonder, was Kel still alive? Did he remember their promise? Despite his loneliness, Elias never gave up. He believed wholeheartedly that someday, somehow, they would stand face to face once more. And so, he continued working, driven by the hope that science could conquer even the vastness of space. Meanwhile, billions of kilometers away, Kel faced challenges of his own. His journey to Proxima Centauri was anything but smooth. The ship encountered cosmic radiation storms, mechanical failures, and strange phenomena that defied explanation. There were days when Kel questioned whether he'd made the right choice, times when the weight of solitude threatened to crush him. But whenever doubt crept in, he thought of Elias and their promise. Those memories kept him going, reminding him why he had embarked on this journey in the first place. Back on Earth, people slowly forgot about Kel and the mission. New discoveries captured their attention, and life moved on. But Elias never stopped believing. Every calculation, every experiment, every sleepless night was dedicated to one goal: reuniting with his best friend. As the years turned into decades, Elias' resolve only grew stronger. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that some bonds were worth fighting for. Somewhere among the stars, Kel was waiting, and Elias would move heaven and earth to bring him home. The years following Kel's departure stretched endlessly, like an unbroken horizon that refused to yield answers. For Elias, each day felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the absence of his best friend. The world around him continued to evolve, but for Elias, time seemed to stand still, frozen in the moment Kel's ship vanished into the void of space. Elias' journey. After Kel left, Elias threw himself into his work with a fervor that bordered on obsession. His lab became both his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could channel his grief into something productive. He spent long hours hunched over blueprints, tweaking designs, and testing prototypes. Colleagues admired his dedication, though few understood the depth of his motivation. To them, it was just another project, a step forward in humanity's quest to conquer the stars. But for Elias, every breakthrough was a step closer to fulfilling his promise. At first, the public celebrated Elias' achievements. When he unveiled the first generation of cryogenic stasis pods, capable of suspending human life for decades without aging, headlines hailed him as a visionary. Reporters flocked to his lab, eager to capture sound bites about the future of space exploration. But Elias rarely spoke about his personal reasons for developing the technology. Instead, he kept his focus on the technical details, deflecting questions about Kel with vague responses or polite smiles. Over time, however, the spotlight faded. New innovations captured the public's imagination, and Elias' contributions were reduced to footnotes in history books. Yet, none of this mattered to him. Fame had never been his goal. Reuniting with Kel was. And so he pressed on, refining his inventions year after year. By the time Elias reached his late 60s, his body began to show signs of wear. His joints ached from countless hours spent standing at his workbench, and his vision blurred when he stared too long at glowing screens. But his mind remained sharp, fueled by memories of Cale and their shared dreams. On quiet nights, he would sit alone in his lab, flipping through old photographs of the two of them together. In those moments, the ache of separation felt almost unbearable. Still, Elias found solace in small victories. Each improvement to his cryogenic tech brought him closer to solving the puzzle of interstellar travel. By 2147, his latest model, the Cryolink 3000, was capable of sustaining life for centuries, far surpassing anything previously imagined. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to give him hope that one day he might use it to bring Cale home. Cale's Odyssey. While Elias toiled away on Earth, Cale faced challenges of his own light years away. The journey to Proxima Centauri was supposed to take 20 years, thanks to advanced propulsion systems designed to reach speeds approaching a fraction of light speed. But reality proved far more complicated than theory. From the moment the mission began, things went wrong. Just 3 months into the voyage, the ship encountered a massive solar flare, its radiation threatening to fry the delicate electronics on board. Cale worked tirelessly with the ship's AI, rerouting power and reinforcing shields until the danger passed. It was a close call, one that left him shaken but determined to continue. As the years dragged on, isolation took its toll. The crew consisted of only 4 members, including Cale, and tensions ran high in the cramped confines of the spacecraft. Arguments erupted over trivial matters, and sleepless nights became routine as paranoia set in. One crew member succumbed to depression, retreating into virtual reality simulations to escape the monotony of space. Another developed severe anxiety, unable to cope with the vast emptiness outside the ship's windows. By the 5th year, Cale was the only one left mentally stable enough to lead. When they finally arrived at Proxima Centauri, nearly 25 years later, the planet was nothing like what scientists had predicted. Instead of lush forests and pristine oceans, they found a barren wasteland battered by constant storms and toxic gases. The air was unbreathable, the soil sterile. Building a colony here would require resources beyond what they had brought with them. Against all odds, Cale refused to give up. Using materials salvaged from the ship, he constructed a rudimentary habitat shielded from the harsh environment. He planted seeds in specially designed domes, experimenting with genetically modified crops that could survive the alien conditions. Slowly, painstakingly, he transformed the desolate landscape into a livable space. But survival came at a cost. The isolation gnawed at him, eating away at his resolve. There were days when he questioned whether anyone back on Earth even remembered him. On those nights, he would pull out a small photo of Elias tucked inside his journal. Staring at it reminded him of why he had come here, to push the boundaries of human achievement, to prove that humanity could thrive anywhere, and most importantly, to honor the promise he had made to his best friend. Parallel lives. Despite being separated by unimaginable distances, Elias and Cale lived parallel lives in many ways. Both men devoted themselves to their respective missions, driven by a mix of ambition and nostalgia. They aged differently. Cale spent much of his time in cryostasis during the journey, preserving his youth, while Elias lived fully on Earth, but neither forgot the other. Flashbacks revealed glimpses of their childhood together. One memory showed them as teenagers, lying side by side in a field under a starry sky. "Do you think we'll ever get to see those stars up close?" Cale had asked, pointing at a constellation. "Of course," Elias replied confidently. "We just have to figure out how." Another flashback depicted their college years, when Cale crashed a prototype drone into a tree during one of Elias' experiments. They laughed until tears streamed down their faces, vowing to build a better version next time. These moments underscored the depth of their bond, highlighting how different yet complementary they were. On Earth, Elias often wondered if Cale still thought about him. Did he remember their promise? Was he still alive? Without answers, Elias clung to the belief that Cale was out there somewhere, waiting for the day they would meet again. For Cale, thoughts of Elias were a lifeline. Whenever doubt crept in, he imagined Elias sitting in his lab, tinkering with some new invention. He pictured his friend's crooked smile and heard his voice saying, "You can do this, Cale." Those mental images gave him strength, helping him endure the hardships of his solitary existence. A world that moved on. Back on Earth, life moved forward without Cale. People grew accustomed to the idea that the mission to Proxima Centauri had failed, its crew lost to the depths of space. Historians wrote books about the endeavor, portraying it as a noble but ultimately doomed attempt at colonization. Memorials were erected in honor of the brave astronauts who had sacrificed everything for progress. But Elias refused to accept that narrative. To him, Cale wasn't gone. He was simply unreachable. Every breakthrough in communication technology reignited his hope that someday, somehow, he might hear from his friend again. He poured resources into researching quantum entanglement, a phenomenon that allowed particles to remain connected across vast distances. If he could harness this principle, he reasoned, he might be able to send a message to Proxima Centauri. It was a long shot, but Elias didn't care. Science had always been about pushing boundaries, about daring to dream the impossible. And if anyone understood the power of dreams, it was Cale. The year was 2147, and Elias Voss stood at the forefront of yet another scientific revolution. For decades, he had been working tirelessly on a project that seemed impossible to most, a quantum communication device capable of transmitting messages instantly across light years. The idea wasn't entirely new. Physicists had theorized about quantum entanglement for centuries, but no one had managed to turn it into practical technology, until now. Elias' lab buzzed with activity as his team ran final tests on the device. The machine itself was a marvel of engineering. A sleek, cylindrical console bristling with wires and glowing panels. At its core lay a cluster of entangled particles suspended in a magnetic field, their connection unbroken regardless of distance. If successful, this device would allow humans to communicate with anyone, anywhere in the universe without delay. For Elias, however, the stakes were deeply personal. This wasn't just about advancing science or proving humanity's ingenuity. It was about reaching out to Cale. 60 years had passed since their farewell. 60 long years filled with questions and doubts. Was Cale still alive? Had he survived the journey to Proxima Centauri b? And if so, did he remember their promise? As the final calibration completed, Elias took a deep breath. He knew there was no guarantee the signal would reach Cale, or that Cale would respond even if it did. But after all these years, he owed it to himself, and to their friendship, to try. Activate the transmitter, Elias instructed, his voice steady, despite the knot tightening in his stomach. The room fell silent as the machine hummed to life. A beam of light shot upward from the console, connecting to a satellite orbiting Earth. From there, the signal would travel through space, riding the invisible threads of quantum entanglement toward Proxima Centauri. It was a gamble, but Elias had spent his entire life taking risks for the sake of progress. And for Cale. Cale's response. Weeks passed without a response. Each day felt longer than the last as Elias waited anxiously for any sign of success. His colleagues urged him to move on, reminding him that the odds were astronomically low. But Elias refused to give up. Every evening, he returned to the lab, checking the monitors for updates. Sometimes, he stayed late into the night, staring at the blinking lights of the transmitter, willing it to bring him good news. Then, one fateful morning, everything changed. Elias was sipping coffee when an alert flashed on his screen. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed to the console. The message was brief, almost cryptic. To whomever this may concern, I'm here. Who is this? Tears welled up in Elias' eyes as he read the words over and over again. After 6 decades of silence, Cale had responded. Against all odds, he was alive. With trembling hands, Elias typed his reply. "It's me, Elias. Do you remember?" The wait for Cal's answer felt like an eternity. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Finally, another message appeared. "Elias, is it really you? I thought I'd never hear your voice again." Elias let out a laugh that turned into a sob. He quickly wiped his eyes before typing back. "It's really me, Cal. I promised we'd reunite someday, didn't I?" From that moment on, the two men exchanged messages daily. Their conversations started cautiously, filled with questions and updates about their lives. Cal described the harsh conditions of Proxima Centauri and the challenges he faced building the colony alone. He spoke of sleepless nights spent staring at the stars, wondering if anyone back on Earth still remembered him. Elias, in turn, shared stories of his work, the advancements he had made in cryogenic technology, and the loneliness he had endured in Cal's absence. They laughed together at old memories, marveling at how much, and how little, they had changed. Despite the years apart, their bond felt as strong as ever. Planning the reunion. As their communication continued, an idea began to take shape in Elias' mind. Quantum messaging was a groundbreaking achievement, but it wasn't enough. Talking to Cal wasn't the same as seeing him, hearing his voice in person, feeling the warmth of his handshake. Elias wanted more. He wanted to bring Cal home. He approached his team with a bold proposal: use the latest generation of cryogenic ships to launch an expedition to Proxima Centauri. The mission would be risky, requiring months of travel and significant resources, but Elias argued that it was worth it, not just for Cal, but for humanity as a whole. If they could retrieve Cal safely, it would prove that interstellar travel was not only possible but sustainable. To his surprise, the idea gained traction quickly. News of Cal's survival spread like wildfire, capturing the world's imagination. People rallied behind the mission, donating funds and volunteering their expertise. Governments and corporations threw their support behind Elias, eager to capitalize on the renewed interest in space exploration. Within weeks, plans were underway. Elias assembled a team of scientists, engineers, and pilots, each handpicked for their skills and dedication. Among them was Lyra Solis, a young astrophysicist whose fascination with Cal's story mirrored Elias' own determination. Lyra became a key member of the crew, bridging the gap between generations and offering fresh perspectives on the mission. Preparations moved swiftly, fueled by a sense of urgency and purpose. The ship, christened the Reunion, was equipped with state-of-the-art cryogenic pods, advanced propulsion systems, and cutting-edge navigation tools. Every detail was meticulously planned, from fuel consumption rates to contingency protocols for emergencies. But beneath the excitement, Elias wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he was thrilled at the prospect of finally reuniting with Cal. On the other, he couldn't shake the fear that something might go wrong. That after all these years, fate would intervene once again. What if Cal had changed too much? What if their reunion didn't live up to his expectations? Cal, meanwhile, prepared for Elias' arrival with equal parts anticipation and apprehension. He cleaned up the colony, repairing equipment and tidying the domes where he grew crops. He rehearsed what he would say, imagining countless scenarios for their first meeting. Would Elias recognize him? Would they still click the way they used to? As the launch date approached, both men found themselves reflecting on their journey. For Elias, it was a testament to perseverance, a reminder that even in a world dominated by machines and algorithms, human connections remained irreplaceable. For Cal, it was proof that hope could endure against all odds, shining brightly even in the darkest corners of the universe. Countdown to liftoff. The day of the launch arrived, and crowds gathered around the facility to witness history in the making. Cameras captured every moment as the Reunion stood poised on the launch pad, its sleek design gleaming under the sun. Inside the cockpit, Elias sat alongside Lyra and the rest of the crew, his hands gripping the controls tightly. "Are you ready?" Lyra asked softly, glancing at him. Tensions within the crew began to surface too. Months of confinement in close quarters took a toll on everyone's mental health. Arguments erupted over trivial matters. Misplaced tools, overlapping schedules, even the temperature settings in the living quarters. Dr. Hale stepped in as a mediator, using his knowledge of psychology to help the team navigate their frustrations. Slowly, they learned to communicate more effectively, turning conflicts into opportunities for growth. For Elias, the emotional weight of the journey was perhaps the hardest burden to bear. As the days turned into weeks, doubts crept into his mind. What if Cale didn't want to leave? As the reunion entered the final leg of its journey, the crew grew increasingly anxious. The sight of Proxima Centauri looming ahead filled them with awe and apprehension. The planet was both beautiful and forbidding, a swirling mass of reds and browns, dotted with jagged mountains and violent storms. It was clear why colonizing it had been such a monumental task. Elias spent hours poring over data transmitted by Cale, mapping out potential landing sites and strategizing how to retrieve him safely. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the controls, a combination of fatigue and anticipation coursing through him. This was it, the moment he had dreamed of for 6 decades. On the morning of their scheduled arrival, Elias gathered the crew for a final pep talk. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "But our job isn't done yet. Today, we fulfill a promise that's been waiting 60 years to be kept. Let's make sure we do it right." The crew nodded, their expressions resolute. As they descended toward the planet's surface, the ship shuddered violently against atmospheric turbulence. Captain Calderon expertly guided them through the chaos, her focus unwavering. Finally, with a jolt, the reunion touched down on solid ground. Through the viewport, Elias caught his first glimpse of Cale standing outside the colony's main dome. Time seemed to stop as their eyes met across the barren landscape. Tears welled up in Elias' eyes as he whispered, "Cale." The moment had arrived. After 60 years of separation, 2 best friends were about to reunite, not just as individuals, but as symbols of hope, perseverance, and the enduring power of human connection. The airlock hissed open, and Elias stepped out onto the surface of Proxima Centauri for the first time. His boots crunched against the rocky terrain as he took in the alien landscape, harsh, desolate, yet strangely beautiful under the dim light of its distant star. But none of that mattered to him. All he could see was Cale. Cale stood a few meters away, his figure silhouetted against the horizon. 60 years had changed him. He was leaner, weathered by decades of survival on this unforgiving planet. But his eyes were unmistakably the same. Bright, alive, and filled with emotion. For a moment, neither man moved. The weight of 6 decades hung heavy between them, stretching time into an eternity. Then, breaking the stillness, Cale took a step forward. Then another, until he was running, closing the distance between them with desperate urgency. Elias mirrored his movements, his heart pounding as they collided in a fierce embrace. Neither spoke. Words felt inadequate in the face of what they had endured. They simply held each other, tears streaming down their faces, overwhelmed by the reality of their reunion. "Elias," Cale finally managed to choke out, his voice trembling. "You came." "I promised I would," Elias replied, his voice thick with emotion. 60 years, but it's here now. We're here." They pulled apart slightly, studying each other's faces as if trying to memorize every detail. Cale laughed through his tears, shaking his head in disbelief. "I thought you'd forgotten me, or worse, that you wouldn't want to come." "Forget you," Elias echoed, his tone incredulous. "How could I? You've been with me every day since you left. Every invention, every breakthrough. It was all for you." Cale smiled, a mixture of gratitude and guilt flashing across his face. "I don't deserve you, Elias. Not after everything you've done. You deserve more than I can give," Elias countered firmly. "But I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know how much you mean to me." Their exchange drew quiet smiles from the crew, who watched the scene unfold with a mix of awe and reverence. Even Captain Calderon, usually stoic and reserved, wiped away a tear. It was a moment that transcended science and technology, a testament to the enduring power of friendship. Rediscovering friendship. Over the next few days, Elias and Cale spent countless hours catching up, rediscovering the bond that had once defined their lives. Cale gave Elias a tour of the colony, explaining how he had transformed the barren wasteland into a livable space. He showed off the domes where genetically modified crops grew, the solar panels powering the habitat, and the makeshift workshop where he repaired equipment. Each story painted a picture of resilience and ingenuity, leaving Elias deeply impressed. In return, Elias shared updates about Earth, its advancements, its challenges, and the people who had inspired him along the way. He told Kel about Lyra, whose fascination with their story had driven her to join the mission, and how her presence reminded him of their younger selves. "She's like us," Elias said with a fond smile, full of hope and determination. As they talked, they realized how much, and how little, they had changed. Cale was still the adventurous dreamer, eager to explore new horizons, while Elias remained the pragmatic thinker, grounded in logic and reason. Yet their differences only strengthened their connection, just as they always had. One evening, as they sat side by side outside the habitat watching the alien sunset, Cale turned to Elias with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever wonder why we're still friends after all this time?" Elias chuckled softly. "Not really. Some things are meant to be. Like stars pulling each other across galaxies, they might drift apart, but gravity always brings them back together." Cale nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, gravity. That's what you've been for me, Elias. My anchor, my reason to keep going." The sincerity in Cal's voice brought tears to Elias' eyes. He reached over and clasped Cal's hand tightly. "And you've been mine. A new beginning,